inaugural launch for the Sargent Shriver Program for Leadership in Public Service. We're excited that all of you are here. And just in brief, Sargent Shriver worked at the nexus of politics, public service, communities. He was somebody who built collaborations, built programs, specifically programs that were sustainable and really had a significant impact. Let me tell you what I mean by that. He created the Peace Corps that has now existed for over 50 years. And if you lowball all of the numbers of Peace Corps volunteers, number of hours of service that they provided, it is more than 1,200,000,000 hours of service since that program was founded. So we think that that's a pretty amazing model, and we think that all of you guys can do that same kind of work, and we want to help you to get there. So I'm very excited to have two wonderful speakers here who will be with us for the remaining 4 sessions that we'll do, the next 3 weeks actually. And I wanted to now both introduce my colleague Nicole Bittler, who is a graduate student here in evolutionary biology, and she's been working as the Shriver Program intern and is basically the reason why all of this exists. And she's been unbelievable, and I would actually like to give her a round of applause because she's been incredible. And she's now going to introduce our speakers, who will then get into the meat of the presentation. We're so glad to have all of you here. If you do need to leave early, please just kind of sneak out, but we're excited to have you participate. And here's Nicole.
All right, so Mr. Josephson is Senior Advisor for the Sargent Shriver Peace Institute. He was a longtime partner, friend, and colleague of Sargent Shriver and contributed directly to the design and scope of the Peace Corps. Mr. Josephson continued to work with Sargent Shriver at the Peace Corps until 1966, holding positions as Special Assistant to the Director and then General Counsel. In 1972, Mr. Josephson was a director of Sargent Shriver's campaign for vice president on the McGovern-Shriver ticket. He is a senior advisor to the Sargent Shriver National Center on Poverty Law in Chicago. In 1965, he received the William A. Jump Award for Exemplary Achievement in Public Administration. He's also been honored by MALDEF, the University of Chicago, and the New York State Archives. Dr. Jamie Price is the Executive Director of the Sargent Shriver Peace Institute. Having been with the Sargent Shriver Peace Institute since its inception in 2006, he has developed its programming and organizational systems, including its mission, research agenda, applied initiatives, and program partnerships. Jamie's current work with the Sargent Shriver Peace Institute has 3 foci: advancing public awareness of the political and social legacy of Sargent Shriver, developing the foundational methodology operative in the peace-building achievements of Sargent Shriver, and building partnerships with other institutions in the development of curriculum projects that educate and train leaders in a variety of public service and social change venues. Jamie holds several academic posts, including those of research professor and founding director of the Insight Conflict Resolution Program in the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University. Jamie holds a PhD from the Divinity School of the University of Chicago and is the inaugural Shriver Fellow for this program at the University of Chicago. Thanks.
Bill and I are very, very happy to be here, not just obviously as a guest, but as a partner with Dylan and Nicole and with all of you. We really look forward to this project and to working. I need to turn my back to working with you over the next 3 weeks to do this project, but also then in the winter and spring and in the summer. I know Bill will make a few remarks talking about the genesis of this program too, but it's really been about a year in the development, maybe a little longer, when we got together with Dylan and Darren and began to see how the missions of our two institutions could actually work. Because when it comes to, or what we're thinking of in terms of leadership for public service, when it comes to Sargent Shriver, what it means, as Dylan indicated, is somebody who is a leader who's able to develop social innovations, to develop new answers to problems of social, of human dignity, of human welfare and security, and to do that, as Dylan pointed out, in sustainable ways. And that's that. And now, for the way that links up with the IOP, as I understand it, is that the concern here is for leaders who are progressive and transpartisan, who do their work and change work in that kind of way. And I say transpartisan, and I'm not sure if we talk about it nonpartisan or transpartisan here, but I say transpartisan because there really is nowhere for anybody to stand that isn't positional in some way. The question is, how do you use the positions you have vis-a-vis other people? How do they influence your decisions? How do they influence the things you value and where you go with it? Because Sarge was partisan in the sense that he was a Democrat, he was a Catholic, he loved Chicago, he went to Yale, he played tennis. I mean, all of these things. And in the broader categories, he was white, he was a man, he's dead, all of those things. But the thing about Sarge was that even though he had his way of doing things, he never used that as a criterion for judging or for excluding people who had different ways of doing things. He, as a matter of fact, was able to retain himself, maintain great fidelity to his Democratic roots, to his Catholic roots, and yet be completely open to other people in their own terms. That's the kind of leader he was. He was a very curious, compassionate person, and it's reflected. We'll talk about that. It's reflected in the programs he created. And so, if you're interested in being a leader who wants to do progressive, transpartisan social innovation, he's somebody that's really worth wrestling with. And speaking of wrestling, really, and this was in the context of as we were putting the program together, we were wrestling with how, particularly here, how not to have a program that's a public service program that's named for Sargent Shriver, that focuses on Sargent Shriver for these 4 weeks, that uses his method in the fall and the spring, that has Sargent Shriver. How do you do that in a way that doesn't fall into the trap that we're trying to avoid, which is to become all Sarge all the time in a way that's partisan or ideological, or because there are, can we have his, Nicole? I'm talking about him. Can we have him up there? There he is. I interrupted myself. How do we do that in the way that I think about him, actually the way that I experience him, is in terms of a concept I learned at the Divinity School from David Tracy, is the notion of a classic. There are lots of leaders, really powerful leaders, who aren't positioned in the world the way Sarge is. And it doesn't mean you can't wrestle with them too. As a matter of fact, you should. So, but I think of Shriver as a classic in the sense that, and this is from Harold Bloom, although I learned it from David Tracy, the classic knows us far better than we know it. There's something about the depth and richness of classic works of art, and I think that goes for leadership, that when you begin to do, as Dylan talks about it, a deep dive into them, it's we find ourselves, we're looking at Shriver, we're studying Shriver, but we find that we're being scrutinized. We who are being revealed, and then the last one, it's we're being forced to consider ourselves in new ways. So really, we're going to be doing a deep dive, I like Dylan's phrase, a deep dive into Shriver, but it's actually about you. It's actually about how do you discover something fundamentally Shriver-esque, if you will, in yourself and in leadership And so I'm ready to go on to talk about Sarge. Do you want to make some remarks?
Well, first thing I'd like to say is thank you for coming. And the most important thing I have to say, perhaps, Nicole, this is not a criticism, but you left out the fact that I'm a University of Chicago undergraduate. And the period from 1949 to 1950, the last Hutchins years, probably made me more of what I am than all the years at Columbia Law School or at Oxford or at anything else. I consider this to be a uniquely wonderful institution. Fortunate to have been here. I hope all of you feel equally fortunate and privileged to be part of this institution. Some important thank yous are in order. Sarge used to say that with 5 good people, you could do anything. And we were fortunate enough to have 5 good people here. Darren, Steve, Dylan, Adam, and Dean Boyer. And without those 5, none of us would be here today, because they had the perception to see that we could try to do, yet again, something many people think is impossible in this day and age, to get people like yourselves to believe that there is nothing you can't accomplish. All that is required is the will and the energy and the skill and the faith. And we'll be talking a lot about all of those 3 things, because they were all extremely important characteristics of Sarge.
Thanks, Bill. I guess one thing I'd be interested in before jumping into Sarge is, since so many of you have come today, what are you hoping for from this seminar, from this set of things? It was snowing earlier, you have other things to do, it's Halloween. This was important enough for you to make the decision to come. Pourquoi? What was, if somebody's willing to say? Yeah, please.
To help with necessary information to make a change.
Thanks. Make a change. So you're hoping that if this goes well, you'll have a sense of how that might be done and how you can do it. Right? Uh-huh.
The idea of, as you said, making a change is a very abstract concept that a lot of us talk about but have no idea how to do. So this kind of teaches us how to solve problems and to actually work with people.
Not just change, but particular change you want to make and how to do it. Good. Thank you. Yes?
I think that maybe through this series of the next 3 workshops, we'll get a better idea of how to maybe make the changes happen. But I think that each one in itself is cause for inspiration, maybe. I mean, learning about how this all began, what the motivation was, and how these people worked really hard to get this done, from you who are involved and know much more about it than we do, is really special. And I think for me at least, is very inspirational.
Thank you. Thank you. Did I miss one? Sorry.
On that note, I really want to learn about how history of change making kind of impacts the present moment, and hear from people who have a lot of experience on how things are different and the same now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, please.
I think when you talk about some of the really incredible work that Shriver was able to do, and how he was able to do that seemed to be by raising up the voices of communities and like mobilizing that power to create this change, create this innovation.
Right.
And this seems like a time that really cries out for that. And so I think I'd like to know more.
Learn more about that stuff. That's great. Oh, pardon me, sir.
A little more than change, but really just even looking at a model for kind of like leadership or something to like look to. Because right now, I mean, it's really easy to be cynical about politics and about leadership and where our country is today, but to really like look back at like the legacy of someone like Sargent Shriver, really delve into it and kind of learn more about his style of leadership, I think is good for our future.
Thanks. Okay, great. Well, he had the opportunity and sought the opportunities to make change, inspire people in a lot of ways over a number of decades, and I just want to sketch those quickly for you. In the 50s, he was in Chicago. Spent his formative years here. He always thought he would come back because he loved Chicago, but it didn't work that way. In the 60s, go ahead. That's fine. So as you see, he was director of the Merchandise Mart. He was the president of the Catholic Interracial Council. He segregated. He integrated what were segregated at that time, all the Catholic high schools and Catholic hospitals. We could do a case study on that. He was president of the Chicago Board of Education and really made a difference in the public schools in the area, or in that time. In the 60s, he moved to Washington, became director of the Peace Corps, got that rolling, was tapped by President Johnson to be the director of the War on Poverty, and then in 68, he became really a transformative ambassador to France. He then, in the 70s and the 80s, as Bill, as we know from Bill's bio, he was the vice presidential candidate on the failed McGovern-Shriver ticket in 72. He ran for president in 76. It didn't catch on, and I think when he didn't win the primary here in Illinois, when he said, "Okay, I will withdraw," and then he became what you could call a citizen diplomat. And he was instrumental in some very interesting policies. No first strike policy on nuclear arms. He was the moving force behind the Catholic bishops' challenge of peace letter. He started the first Christian Jewish-Muslim trialogue to try to deal with the problem of the war and religious motivation of the Middle East problems. And then he was also a leader on U.S.-Soviet détente. And the wonderful thing about having Bill here with us is that Bill was with him through most of this. Not only was Bill he's a classic in his own right, and it's wonderful to have him here. So because we're in Chicago, and because it's the lead up to his work in the Peace Corps, and because we have a documentary with a short clip on what was going on for Shriver in Chicago, I thought I would play that. The screen is better than the video, so it kind of gets a little fuzzy, but you'll see what he looked like and what was going on.
The Shrivers settled in Chicago, where Sarge was running the Kennedy-owned Merchandise Mart. Shriver became president of the Board of Education, and he led a Catholic civil rights organization that challenged Catholic hospitals and schools to desegregate. Chicago's news editors were touting Shriver for governor, but all bets were off when Eunice's father asked Sarge for help on his son Jack's presidential bid.
It can't have been easy for a guy who, throughout the 1950s, had been building a very powerful political career, and many people were talking about him as being the next governor or senator from Illinois. And he marries into this uber political family, the Kennedy family, and all of a sudden he has to take a back seat to all the aspirations of Jack and Bobby and Ted. For a lot of people with political aspirations, that wouldn't have been something they could have done and survived. They would have become resentful or bitter. Shriver was able to both be a very loyal family member while at the same time retaining, for the most part, his own political identity as well.
Many people have asked about Sarge, because of his connections to the Kennedy family, would he have been a national figure if he hadn't married into that family? There's a very good chance he would. He was a very powerful person, and of course he used all those opportunities. Where Scott Stossel, who wrote the book some of you have, was commenting that here he was going to be running for senator, he was going to be running for governor. People were hoping that he would. In Illinois, he had a standing invitation to run, to come back from Washington and run. But he went to work on the Kennedy campaign, and he did that, and then he ran the talent search during the transition for Kennedy after Kennedy won. He was there for the inauguration, came back home to Chicago, to his apartment in Chicago, right after the January 20th, when the inauguration was, of course. So this was the 21st. And President Kennedy on that day called him, seems to have called him a couple of times, wanted to talk to him. And we have a clip of Sarge talking about that event. You get a sense of his humor and sense of self-presence.
I'd gone back to Chicago when the phone rang. It was the president on there, and he called a couple of times, and finally my wife said, "Sarge, you got to talk to Jack now. Remember, he's the president." And so I said, "Well, all right, I will." So about the third time I got on the phone, he said, "Listen, you've got to come down here to Washington and run the Peace Corps." I said, "Well, Mr. President, you know, I don't know anything about any Peace Corps." And he said, "Well, that's all right, neither does anybody else." I said, "But yes, but remember all the political debts you incurred during the campaign. Why don't you give this job to one of your political friends?" He said, "Listen, Sarge, the truth of the matter is that everybody thinks the Peace Corps is going to be one of the greatest fiascos in history. It turns out that way. It's much easier to fire a relative than a political friend."
So he makes light of it, and he makes it fun. But when if you put yourself in his shoes, if you think about what it must have been like for him to get this call and to have to find a solution to international conflict and peace and development that nobody had ever tried before. And not only was he called upon to find that kind of a thing, he was put under a hard deadline. The president told him he wanted the answer by the end of February. He wanted the answer in about 30 days. So he had that much time, and this is how he described it later, looking back. He says, "President Kennedy had not even given me a bill. I had only 4 or 5 sentences from a campaign speech in California to go on. It was like seeing a picture of a cake and then being told to bake one. There were no ingredients, no measurements, no idea even of what kinds of substances it should include." So Sarge is clearly distinguishing two kinds of problems, and you're familiar with both, I think. One is implementing a solution that's already known. We know how to do it. Or somebody else has done it, find out what they did and implement it. Here he's in a situation where we don't even know what the solution is. We have to discover the answer. We have to solve the problem first. This is, are we okay? There we go. So Sarge's ability to do that, to discover the recipe for a cake, is what I mean by his method. Is what we do when we use a method. But his ability to do that was formative to his work as a public service leader. And I think if there's anything that I would like it for you to walk out of here today with, is a notion of what that method was. We're going to talk about it, why it might have worked, and to wrestle with that, because that's the point of today. The methodological challenge. He had a problem to solve, which was do this Peace Corps thing, make it work, make it change the world, really. Next time, we will talk about, well, what did he discover? What was the mechanism he discovered? And why did it work? The third session will be then, once he had formulated it, come up with the idea. How do you get buy-in for it? How do you get it politically approved? How do you sell it to the public? How do you get people around leaders around the world to say you want it? How do you deal with resistance from within the administration to move it forward? All of those kinds of political challenges. And then finally, does it really work? Does the method work? And the fourth one is the challenge on that. And the case study example here will be could have taken many, but it'll be the experience of Peace Corps volunteers in the Dominican Republic in 1965, when there was a revolt, when constitutionalists wanted to restore Juan Bosch, who'd been overthrown by a junta, to his rightful, they thought, place as the head of government. And there were 109 Peace Corps volunteers, many of them in Santo Domingo, working for the people who were constitutionalists. And President Johnson thought this was a communist takeover, so he sent 25,000 Marines in. And Sarge had the dilemma of, do you let Peace Corps volunteers stay? Do you give them the choice to stay? Do they stay? Well over half of them decided to stay and did amazing things. And so we'll have one of the Peace Corps volunteers who did that with us. His name's Kirby Jones, in 3 weeks. So that's the thing. But now I want to shift back to, well, what was this problem? Some history of the Peace Corps. How did it happen? And we've got 3 clips for that. Here's the origin of the idea. It was late in the Kennedy campaign, about 3 weeks left before the election. And here we go.
The witness will not be seen tonight, so that we may bring you this third discussion between Vice President Nixon and Senator Kennedy.
On October 13th, Kennedy and Nixon square off in the third of their famous televised debates.
Good evening, Senator Kennedy.
Good evening, Mr. Shadell.
And good evening to you, Vice President Nixon.
Good evening, Mr. Shadell.
So far, many have graded Nixon superior as a debater, especially those who hear the debates on radio. But on television, Kennedy's appearance and command of the stage and camera gives him the edge.
I believe we must meet our commitment.
Many students at the University of Michigan tune into the debate. Most are under 21 and therefore too young to vote in 1960. Nevertheless, there's great interest because later that night, Kennedy's coming to the Michigan campus.
We didn't have a television. Most people didn't at that point. And so a group of us went to the Union because they had a TV set up there and we were going to watch the debates. And word sort of spread around that after the debates, he was going to come here, Kennedy was going to come here to Ann Arbor.
Coming in, we didn't know if he'd even speak.
That was a lark. I think it was a lark for a lot of people. You know, maybe the next president of the United States is going to be in Ann Arbor. Now, Ann Arbor's not New York City, it's a little town, you know, so hell, well, maybe we'll just walk 3 blocks and see what happens.
In my freshman English class, I met a young lady named Marcia McCann. And she was quite enamored of John F. Kennedy. And so one night in October, she said, you know, he's coming to campus and I want to go, but he's going to be there pretty late. And so she, I think, wanted an escort. I was pretty interested in Marcia, so I thought,
we came on down and word was, no, he's not here yet. It's going to take a while.
The crowd just kept getting bigger and bigger.
It was unbelievable how many people were down here that evening when he came out to speak.
They didn't get crowds like that for football games. In those days, the football team wasn't that good.
It was building. This sense of excitement was unbelievable.
There was just this fervor in the air, and people were walking around in the street and talking to each other and walking around and talking, and walking around and talking and getting wet and wet and wet. And there was just a tremendous amount of energy and lightning energy, sparkling energy. That was like a fire, a flame that was igniting everybody who was around there. And everybody wanted to participate, and everybody was committed to staying there.
Nixon and people and the Kennedy people were sort of a little having fun arguing with each other and all that kind of stuff.
especially among the young women, it was almost like a rock star. You know, he really had a following, and there was a kind of an electric atmosphere.
There was a surprise that there'd be so many people that late at night. And those of us who realized it knew that, well, there's a woman's curfew. 11 o'clock was the curfew hour for women, co-eds in the dormitories at least.
If you failed to do that, you actually got punished. There was a student judiciary punishment.
We had to continue to evaluate whether or not we were going to stay there or not. And as women, we had to be indoors in those dorms by what time, 10 or 11, and it was way past then. And so we had to continually get permission from the Dean of Women to stay out late.
And I remember the loudspeaker saying, Dean Bacon extends the curfew for women for another half an hour. And this went on until 2 o'clock in the morning.
And we wondered whether in the middle of the night anybody would have waited to hear him speak.
Flying from New York to Willow Run Airport outside of Detroit, Kennedy quickly drove to Eastern Michigan University in Ypsilanti. With just 3.5 weeks until the election, in an extremely tight race, he couldn't pass up any opportunity to make a speech and play to the student crowd.
I do not know which part of the student body of the university is here tonight.
By now, it's around 1:30 in the morning, and according to the campaign itinerary, the next stop was the Michigan Union and sleep. But upon arrival, Kennedy discovered that there were thousands of students waiting for him. He would have to speak to them. But speak about what? His choice of topics would be historic. To choose this time and this place, to put forth an idea and challenge that he and others had been considering. What prompted that choice? According to Tom Hayden, who was then the editor of the Michigan Daily student newspaper, and would go on to become a famous activist, what prompted Kennedy was a letter that both he and other Michigan students had written to both presidential campaigns, asking about where they stood on a number of issues, including a national youth corps. One of those students was at the curb to personally deliver the letter to Kennedy.
Kennedy came down and he was introduced to the student, Dave McLeod, and McLeod told him what it was about. Kennedy opened the envelope, read the letter, this letter, and put it in his pocket and said, I'll be speaking to one of those points tonight.
And Kennedy simply mounted those steps. I stayed watching and listening at the bottom of the steps.
Can you imagine standing at 2 o'clock in the morning and a cold, drizzling night, seeing oceans of students in front of you and going, oh my gosh? The students were inspiring him.
He didn't speak all that long. First he opened up with a joke.
I want to express my thanks to you as a graduate of the Michigan of the East, Harvard University.
He instantly had us. He acknowledged us. He let us know that we were rightfully proud to be Michigan people. So he boosted us.
And then Kennedy shifted from seeking votes to issuing a challenge.
How many of you who are going to be doctors are willing to spend your days in Ghana, technicians or engineers? How many of you are willing to work in the foreign service and spend your lives traveling around the world? On your willingness to do that, not merely to serve 1 year or 2 years in the service, but on your willingness to contribute part of your life to this country, I think will depend the answer whether a free society can compete. I think it can. And I think Americans are willing to contribute. But the effort must be far greater than we've ever made in the past. And therefore, I'm delighted to come to Michigan, this university, because unless we have those resources in this school, unless you comprehend the nature of what is being asked of you, this country can't possibly move through the next 10 years in a period of relative strength. So I come here tonight to go to bed, but I also come here tonight to ask you
May I just say in conclusion that this college, this university, is not maintained by its alumni, by the state, merely to help its graduates have an economic advantage in the life struggle. There is certainly a greater purpose, and I'm sure you recognize it, and therefore I do not asking for your support in this campaign. I come here tonight asking your support for this country over the next decade. Thank you.
So I would like to say, first of all, that we need to give Paul Long a credit for this wonderful film. This is just a clip. But on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Peace Corps, the University of Michigan commissioned a long film from Paul, all of which is worth watching, because one of the points he goes on to make is the extraordinary contribution of University of Michigan alumni to the country, to the Peace Corps. And that is an occasion also for me to tell you, in case you don't know, that the University of Chicago, by size, weight, and any other consideration, is the largest single contributor of Peace Corps volunteers to the Peace Corps.
Obviously, we could spend a long time analyzing and talking about the dynamics of that clip, and we don't have them, or at least I haven't set things up so that we would have them. But the key thing to note, I mean, I think is the sense of urgency in President Kennedy's voice about what was at stake. I mean, concerned that a free society can compete in the world, concerned that the U.S. would survive over the next 10 years. Those themes echo in his other speeches, in his State of the Union address, where he formally launches the Peace Corps 3 months later. But the concern was really the U.S. and Soviet Cold War and many, surrogate hot wars all over the world.
You know, in the University of Chicago tradition, Jamie and I have put together a series of documents which went out over your internet. And I'd like you to pay attention in particular, given what Jamie just said, to Kennedy's State of the Union message in 1961. You have to understand something that I think only someone who lived through that era really can appreciate, and that is what a desperate situation the world faced in this incredible competition between two nuclear-armed world powers, the United States and Russia. Was a competition for faith, if you will, faith in systems, a totalitarian system based on terror and repression, and a capitalistic system which, of course, has its strengths and weaknesses, but essentially based on individual initiative and freedom. Sitting and preparing for this class and rereading that State of the Union message, I was just struck by what a parlous world Kennedy was confronting in 1961. Remember, the Bay of Pigs is just around the corner, and the Cuban Missile Crisis is just around the next corner.
And the 3 weeks, so roughly two weeks later, this has gone, the movement toward a Peace Corps has gone from a student-inspired, kind of spontaneous speech at the University of Michigan to a policy proposal at the Cow Palace. And we got a little clip of that from Paul Long's film, too.
Just 6 days before the election, 40,000 people packed the Cow Palace in San Francisco to hear the speech. It was the height of the Cold War, and foreign policy was the #1 issue. Soviet aggression and the threat of a nuclear war were very real. Intense competition was being waged by the two superpowers for the hearts and minds of the Third World. To help win that competition, in his speech, Kennedy formally proposed the Peace Corps, saying, quote, "When I suggested at the University of Michigan that we needed young men and women willing to give up a few years to serve their country in this fashion, the students proposed a new organization to promote such an effort. Others have indicated a similar response, offering a tremendous pool of talent that could work modern miracles for peace in dozens of underdeveloped nations."
Only foreign aid policy program that Kennedy had committed to in the course of the campaign.
Without the University of Michigan students picking up the ball that he had thrown in ambiguous ways with no plan in his mind, but a general idea, and saying, we will go if you form a service program overseas.
Kennedy wouldn't have included that in the speech. And if they didn't include that in the speech, there would be no peace.
I'd like to say you saw a little clip of Ted Sorensen. The story is, for whatever it's worth, that stepping down from the rostrum at the University of Michigan, JFK turned to Ted and said, something is going on here. And we need to take advantage of that something, and you need to write a speech that addresses these issues. Now, the truth of the matter is, unfortunately, that Ted turned out to be one of the most significant disparagers of Sargent Shriver and one of the most significant thorns in my side, at least until his daughter Julia, many years later, Julia now teaches at Northwestern Law School, became a Tunisian volunteer. And then, of course, Ted turned into the biggest backer the Tea ever was. But nevertheless, he did write the Cow Palace speech. And as Guskin says in the film, without the Cow Palace speech, without that public commitment, probably there would have been no Peace Corps.
And that public commitment wouldn't have. We're going to show one more clip about this period, which shows how instrumental the students were in this. So this one's.
We didn't do anything right after that. I mean, that's what's interesting. I think everybody was talking about it. A lot of people were energized by it.
It took the students of the University of Michigan several days to say, what are we going to do about this challenge? And the Peace Corps was the response to their urging, Kennedy's inspiration, and the ground that had been seeded by all of these other expressions of a calling.
To heed that calling, the students needed one more trigger.
It was the 3-4 days later when Chester Bowles came.
Congressman Chester Bliss Bowles was a foreign policy advisor to the Kennedy campaign.
Who knew Chester Bowles? I mean, he's from Connecticut. He was in an advertising firm. He was a congressman. He was a liberal guy, but, you know, we didn't know him at all.
And like many campaign surrogates, Bowles toured the country speaking on behalf of his candidate, typically to just a handful of people.
Over 500 people came to the Union Ballroom, overflowing crowd. We were in the back, standing against the back wall, and people were just energized. I think what happened is somebody asked him a question about what Kennedy had said. And what Bowles then said, talked about his son and daughter-in-law, who were basically working with the African-American Institute in Nigeria, doing a Peace Corps-like job. And he started talking about that.
And that really reinforced for us that this is real, this can happen, that people with a lot of experience in foreign affairs think that this is a good approach. So that was really a blessing to have happened.
And I think that's when the light bulbs went off and connected what Kennedy had said to what we could do. And it was that night that my wife and I went off and we went to a restaurant, as we sometimes did, to eat. And in the basement of that restaurant, we wrote in the back of a napkin the letter to the Michigan Day. To the editor, Representative Chester Bowles and Senator Kennedy, in reply to this urgent request, we both hereby state
That we would devote a number of years to work in countries where our
we
help
also
is
would like to request that all students who feel that they would like to help
send a letter to this paper
and/or our address.
If at all possible, we would like students to start asking others in their classes, dorms, sororities, fraternities.
We express our faith that those of us who have been fortunate enough to receive an education
or want to apply their knowledge through direct participation in undeveloped communities of the world. Signed, Alan E. Guskin and Judith P. Guskin, graduate students.
After sending the letter in, the Guskins went over to the Michigan Daily to see if it would be published. They met with the student paper's editor, Tom Hayden.
I was a ambitious, young, idealistic student journalist, editor of the campus paper, and I was very aware of the rising tide of activism around me.
And that awareness suddenly grew stronger because of the response to the Guskins' letter and the eruption of activity on the Michigan campus.
I think what happened that surprised people after Kennedy's visit was the number of students and faculty who came to meetings, who showed up, who wanted to be involved, who asked to meet us and talk about the issues.
In the past, you had 10, 15 students come to meeting. You had hundreds, 100, 200, 300 come to meeting. We had faculty come in to talk about what this means. We talked about what we thought. And people were just people on campus were surprised.
It wasn't a small group of students protesting. It wasn't just a march that ended. It was a sustained effort on campus to be a part of this something new that might happen. And I think that changed things for people.
And there were students who were not involved in anything else. They were not the young Democrats or the young Republicans or some activist group. They were just ordinary students who wanted to do something. That's the moment, I think, in the passing the torch. It crystallized.
I'm up.
Oh, yeah.
So I think there's an important point to be made here that is typical of the gestation period of important policy changes. There was a reference, Chet made a reference to his son Sam, now a distinguished economist, and his daughter-in-law Nancy. They were in Nigeria in a program called Crossroads Africa, a small program that Reverend Jim Robinson had created in the 50s. There were other ideas like this germinating. Senator Humphrey had a bill in Congress in the late 50s for what he called a .4 Peace Corps. I'll come back to that .4 mention in a moment. But as a consequence of that bill, of which Senator Kennedy was certainly aware, a study had been commissioned by the State Department at the University of Colorado to flesh out this idea of the .4 Peace Corps. And there's a letter in your documents dated September 30, a remarkable date, by Sam Hayes, who was a faculty member at the University of Michigan, already sketching out themes that would become themes in the Peace Corps. And back to .4. .4 was a very, very important Truman administration initiative. It was to send middle-level technicians to developing countries to assist in the development role by bringing their specialized skills. .4 got obliterated in the 50s as President Eisenhower and Secretary of State Dulles converted the Truman program into what became known as the Mutual Security Program, with tremendous amounts of money being poured into military assistance, being poured into defense support of countries like Iran, for example, that were joining all of these alliances, NATO, CENTO, CETO, that Dulles was wandering around the world setting up in order to try to surround Russia and, to some extent, China. So there was a certain nostalgia in the State Department, which I joined in 1958, for the idealism and the self-sacrifice and the exchange principles of Point 4, and to some small extent, as you will find out, my colleague Warren Wiggins and I tended to think about the Peace Corps as the lineal successor of Point 4.
To get back to Sarge. So all of this happened. He got the phone call. He's moving to D.C. And again, he reflects back and he says, of course, youthful enthusiasm, students, and noble purposes of the president weren't enough. They had to be combined with hard-headed pragmatism and realistic administration. In the early days of the Peace Corps, meaning the first few weeks, we were looking for a formula for practical idealism. The idealism, of course, was the making peace. The practical was making it work. The formula was the setup for how are you actually going to do that. It's the looking for that I'm kind of interested in here for this particular session, because we'll talk about the practical idealism in number 4. We'll talk about the formula next time, more specifically. But what was he doing when he was looking for? He was solving a problem. He was solving a problem of what is the Peace Corps? How do you make it work? And he was using his method. So can I have the next? And I think of a method as a framework that helps us guide in the way we direct and use our minds to discover the solution to a problem. And I distinguished that from a formula, and he did too, which is a framework that helps us guide and direct the way we use our minds to implement the solution to a problem. So there's problem solving and there's problem implementation. And in those things, we've got 3 functionally related variables. We have the object of inquiry. What are we trying to do? What are we focused on? We have the operation of our mind, because we're using our minds to solve that problem, to study it, to learn, to figure it out. And we also have the framework that we've drawn on to guide and use our minds for doing that. Now, let me see if I have anything here that obviously, objects can differ, frameworks can differ. You learn a lot of them here. You've used a lot of them. The point to figuring out what Sarge was doing is to make these kinds of differentiations, so we know precisely what we mean by method and how they work. And so I want to focus just briefly, very kind of quickly, on the operations of our mind, because we do all kinds of knowing, all kinds of doing, all kinds of choosing, all kinds of deciding, all kinds of valuing. But often we just do those things. We don't necessarily pay attention to what we're doing when we're doing that, and understand what Sarge was up to, and then the program that he ultimately decided. It's helpful. It's very, very helpful to get critically grounded in that. So what are we doing when we're knowing? There are actually 3 phases, 3 basic operations. And what I have going here in terms of the mind, the object, and the framework, this is obviously a framework that I'm using. Again, I learned it here, or began to learn it here when I studied work of Bernard Lonergan in the Divinity School. But this is basically cognitional theory, and you've probably run into it somewhere. But the first thing we do when we know is we experience something. There's an input of data. There are 2 basic sources from our sense, data of sense, but also data of consciousness, and that's what we're focusing on. We're focusing on now. And we can either be attentive or inattentive to it. You can notice a smell or not, notice a sound or not, pay attention when somebody tells us their name or not. I'm sure you're aware of those kinds of notice when somebody puts their hand on our shoulder, or maybe not. But spontaneously we move in consciousness from that experiencing to ask, well, what is this? And that shifts us to another level, which is understanding. To move from experience to understanding. And again, there's a performance range that we have. We can be either curious about what's happening or not. And we move from experience to understanding. Just because we have an insight about something, though, just because we have a grasp of what it is, doesn't mean that it's the case. There's a 3-step. You might see somebody there, and I might think, oh, that's Adam coming. And then I find out, no, that's not Adam. That's somebody else. So there's a question that comes up: if we're not, is it so? And we move on to verifying, where again we can either be critical or hasty. So knowing is a combination of experiencing, understanding, and verifying. And if you read Lonergan and other things, there's no accident that scientific method is basically a question of setting up hypotheses to verify things, because that channels the way we use our minds to figure out problems of scientific reality. But we don't stop there as knowers. And there's often a confusion or a lack of differentiation between what we're doing when we're using our mind to know things and what we're doing when we're using our mind to do things. And this is when we move into Sarge's realm, because we don't stop with verifying. We move on to, well, what does this matter? So what? It's snowing this morning. It's Halloween this morning. The Shriver seminar is starting. Class may be happening. So we engage in valuing. What does it matter? We have spontaneous, affective responses to that. Kennedy's coming. What should I do? And thousands of students showed up. And in the valuing, again, there's a performance range. We can be either mindful or reactive. And when, well, let's just go on. And the next thing is when we move from valuing, we don't stop there. We go from what could I do to deliberating. Well, what should I do? And in those situations, depending upon where we are, depending upon what's happening, we can be either imaginative or limited. In conflict situations, when we're under threat, and that's the focus of the Peace Corps. When you see somebody or something happens to you and you go, uh-oh, we tend to be reactive rather than mindful. And as a result, what we can do, and what that means is our questioning about what's happening or who this is. It's really, when you're in conflict, it's really, really very difficult to be curious about the other person, curious about who they are, what they mean, what they intended. We have, and we get very closed, limited in the options. What should I do? We move to evaluating. There we can be either conscientious or rash. Be very careful about our decisions, or just say, yeah, let's go. Will I do it? We move to deciding, and our decisions could be either free or constrained. So there's a flow of consciousness that has a pattern. And I know, and this was very quickly done. We should spend a lot more time with it. But the point is that methods in problem solving direct that flow. They help us to pay attention to certain things, to get certain insights. Scientific method would have us, when we want to discover things, would have us say, Galileo verified this. He found out that the physical world was mathematically intelligible. We could use mathematical reasoning to discover what's going on in nature. So it's important to pay attention to quantitative factors, to measure those, to figure out ways to measure those, and that enables us to shape the way we use our mind to solve problems. Could we just have that last one? When we're acting, method to use our minds well in discovering the solution to a problem is a matter of helping. If what method if what method is important, scientific method is useful at helping us to be attentive and curious and critical, Shriver's method was helpful in enabling us to be mindful, imaginative, conscientious, and free when it came to dealing with threats, with enemies, rather than reactive, limited, rash, and constrained. So what did he do when he was doing that? It was a real debate at the time. Okay, thanks. He posed the question in a speech. He gave this to the Council on Foreign Relations, to people who were very skeptical about Peace Corps and about what it could really do. And he posed the question as this: in this world of the Cold War and the many little hot wars, in the face of such enormous and complex forces that are moving today, isn't it an illusion to think that the Peace Corps might actually help to bring peace, help to change the world? It lets you show that they were taking this program seriously. 50 years later, we kind of think, oh, well, you know, there's this service program and there's that service program, and it's good, you go do it. But this was to bring world peace. That's what Shriver developed it for. That's what it's still good for, even if it isn't necessarily thought of with the kind of urgency that it was at the time. And so conscientious or rash, that was linking back to what I was doing before to say, is this, in evaluating what to do, is this a good thing to do? So, okay, thanks, Nicole. Next one. Wall Street Journal on March 6th, which was the day that Shriver's appointment as director was announced, didn't think it was. Said, this thing is so completely disproportionate as to be nonsensical. That is the enthusiasm for the Peace Corps. The wars of the civilized world did not break out because there was any lack of peoples-to-peoples contact between Germans and Frenchmen. And what person, except perhaps the very young themselves, can really believe that an Africa aflame with violence will have its fires quenched because some Harvard boy or Vassar girl, shall we say a University of Chicago student, lives in a mud hut and speaks Swahili? What do you do with that? How do you answer that? Which, you know, if you're, here's what Sarge did. Next one. He turned it into a question of method for his audience there and for us too. He said, let me ask the question in a different way. What's going to change the world? How do you solve this problem? What method do you use? If you believe people must live together in harmony in this conflict-ridden world, how's this going to come about? And he rejects some things. Guns won't change the world. That's one of the great lessons of this bloody century. Dollar bills won't do it. You can't buy people's allegiance. You can't force people's allegiance. Nor will simple goodwill. You can't just want them to do it. So the question is, what enables people to change their minds? What enables people to make a shift from a decision which says, I view you as my enemy, I view you as a threat, the decisions I'm going to make are going to be good from my perspective, which is to keep myself safe. How do you shift a perspective, somebody, to have that, to have them doubt that, to have them question that? And his answer was this. What will change the world, according to Sarge? The fact is that compassion and service can dissolve obstacles of race or belief anywhere in the world. People are hungry for contact, for fellowship, for the breaking down of barriers. I want to suggest that this isn't just his opinion. I mean, it is his opinion. But it isn't just a nice thing that a Catholic might say. It's really a methodological statement that we'll explore. So I want to compare those. The first one's still there, and I just shifted the scientific one. The fact is that mathematical reasoning and quantitative analysis can solve problems of physics and chemistry and biology anywhere in the world. People are hungry for knowledge, for discovery, and for the breaking down of scientific barriers. I don't think we have any trouble with the second one. We've had 400 years to kind of internalize a culture in which that method of that confidence that we have in solving unknown problems in science, it's like, well, yeah, scientists can do that. That's what they're there for. Public servants, solving problems of youth violence in Chicago, solving problems of racial conflict. We're less confident in that, and I just want to suggest that that's a problem of method, and that's what Shriver was proposing. Okay. Now, just to take a look at what he meant by compassion, and maybe why it works. He means this as a spiritual value, not an ideological one, not a doctrinaire one, not a specifically Catholic one. For saints and sages of the great religions have always agreed that a peace that passes understanding can be reached only by compassion. Because it's only with this compassion that men and women, can look upon man through the mask of many colors, through the vestment of many religions, through the dust of poverty, or through the disfigurement of disease, and recognize his brother. The question, I think, to ask, or that Sarge asks us to ask, is, what is it about compassion that enables us to have our way of doing things, our religion, our color, our economic status, be held in such a way that it doesn't force us to exclude others? How does compassion work? How does it keep us more, in those categories I talked about earlier, how does it keep us more reactive? How does it keep us more mindful rather than reactive? More imaginative rather than limited? More conscientious rather than rash? And more free? And for him, this is the ideal that must illuminate from the very center all our efforts to bring a better life to our world, within our own country, and in the farthest reaches of the planet. So he was serious about it. I didn't just cherry pick a quotation. Next one. Service. If you can remember those sort of four categories of valuing, deliberating, evaluating, deciding, there's a way in which something is the case. Compassion has to do with the valuing side of things. It's how you hold what you see before you. Can you stay curious about it or not? Service is what you do in response. And his claim was, for changing the world, that free and committed men and women can cross, even transcend, boundaries of culture and language, of alien tradition and great disparities of wealth, old hostilities and new nationalisms, when they meet other men and women on the common ground of service to human welfare and human dignity. If you commit yourself to working for the dignity and welfare of another person, he says, you will find yourself transcending boundaries of culture and language, tradition, hostilities, nationalism. And he brings to his method, as do all good methodologists, an empirical principle. And he says, and sure, Bill can verify this, my work has taken me to 30 countries. It's enabled me to send young Americans of every religious persuasion to almost 50 countries of mixed belief. He's talking about Peace Corps volunteers, of course. I've seen firsthand how basic spiritual values and deeds can shatter barriers of politics and creed. So that was his method. And then this is to show that he was just fully convinced that this is what, and just so you know, this is what he was doing. He said the Peace Corps is an example of the need for spiritual values in the work of government. Government should be more compassionate. Government should be more service-oriented. And for him, separation of church and state does not mean the divorce of spiritual values from secular affairs. He didn't conflate religious language, religious traditions, religious belief with how those norms and values move somebody's heart. As a matter of fact, he said quite the opposite. If the state enters the battle for social justice without our strongest weapons, the spiritual belief from which social action springs, our efforts will be doomed to failure. If you don't bring compassion and service into the work of government, into the work of public service, the work you try to do isn't going to work. He's willing to make that as an empirical claim. We'll explore and test this from every level you want to going forward. Again, It's not, this isn't to be ideological, this isn't to be theological even though there's a dimension to that, and even though I come from the divinity school, and obviously I like talking about these sorts of things. But what's interesting in our time is that Shriver represents, I mean, these were positions he was staking out in 1961, 1962, 1963, which is the same time the Supreme Court was making its decisions on the religion clauses of the First Amendment, came down in a different way. And over the past 50 years has generated a number of conflicts which are playing out in the elections we're going to see in the next 50 days. In some way, in the next few days. In some ways, Sarge's method is a road not formally traveled by the U.S. on these issues, even though Peace Corps, even though all of his programs still exist, they haven't been reflected on formally in this kind of way. What do I have next? I forgot. Let me hold that for 1 sec. Oh, go back one. Okay. There's a way in which, and I guess my claim is this to sort of leave you with, is that just as, and it's kind of a radical claim, but just as Galileo was a person who said, I wonder if the world is, he was a geometer and he liked math and he'd been thinking about this for a long time, but he thought, I wonder if the world is mathematically intelligible. And so he devised his experiment, which I'm sure you all know, to figure out, to explain how falling objects fall and why they go faster as they approach the Earth. And he found out he could mathematically explain that. And it was the first experiment that was set up that way. There were we can't even imagine a world without numbers and schedules and standardized measurements and things like that. There was none of that. No timepieces, no standard measurements. There were, anyway. Shriver, but he didn't have to add or prove that that the physical world was mathematically intelligible. He just used that as a background assumption and built his experiments around that. For Shriver, not the physical world, but the world of human action, the world of human history, is spiritually intelligible. And he built his experiments, one of them being the Peace Corps, around that notion. And two of the keys are compassion and service. So if you have a problem, his method would say, what should we pay attention to? What should we notice? How should we set up? What should we set up opportunities for? To link people with what he thought was the spirit, because he didn't think this is a theological piece, and he had theological readings by his bed every night. He didn't really think that people could be attentive, curious, critical, mindful, imaginative, conscientious, and free without some help. In his tradition, the help was grace, the help of the Spirit, but you don't need to do anything for that. You just need to set things up so that people spontaneously cooperate with it, so that their decisions have the opportunity to participate in it. And for him, that was set people up with the opportunity to exercise their compassion. They'll get help. Just like Galileo could set up a rolling incline and measure it, and the background, the intelligibility of the universe would become manifest. Similarly with service. So when thank you. And you have these documents in your packet, when beginning February 1st, Sarge had a number of proposals in front of him, along with all kinds of other, testimony and documents. He had the Hayes proposal for an international youth service, Millikan Memorandum on for an International Youth Service, and the Wiggins and Josephson document on the Towering Task of National Peace Corps, it wasn't that he came to them blind or threw them up in the air. He had a framework that he used to check out whether or not he thought these initial proposals could solve the problem he was trying to solve. Were they going to be formulas that could answer those things? We'll look at those in detail next time, and why and how they got transformed over the period from February 1st to February 22nd, when the report went to the president. So I kind of leave, and I leave you with, I don't leave you, but this is my last slide, and then we can shift into other things, to more questions and conversation. But I guess I'm wondering, if you were at the track and you had to bet on one of these horses, you couldn't bet on both of them, which one you might put your money on. Scenario 1 is horse 1. To help transform the growing crisis in energy and climate change, biogenetic scientists will create a photosynthetic organism that converts sunlight directly into hydrogen energy that can be safely, feasibly, and effectively used in homes, public spaces, and industrial enterprises. Kind of what I imagine there is photosynthesis becomes the source of our energy supply. Scenario 2, to help transform the upsurge in retaliatory youth violence in Chicago, students at the University of Chicago will create a program that makes it possible for people to safely and effectively transform the personal, social, and political patterns of hostility, righteousness, and certainty that drive the decision to use violence in conflict situations. Which horse would you bet on coming in first, assuming you had all the... Most people I talk to would go for scenario 1. They don't see how this can really happen. I think the issue is a question of method. Were you going to say? Did I miss you in the corner of my...
I was definitely thinking scenario 2.
Good. Tell me why.
This is more of like, because scenario 1, obviously, I don't doubt that can't happen, but I think that's more of a thing that doesn't involve like people-to-people interaction, whereas with scenario 2, I think that as an individual, there's a much higher likely chance of me being able to affect another individual through an interaction with them. So that's kind of why I go for scenario 2.
And you think it's definitely possible?
Yes.
Cool. Fans of scenario 2? Who are you? Yeah.
I think it also comes down to a certain need, which is definitely kind of what he was also mentioning. Whereas scenario 1 would, of course, have a tremendous impact on society. I think the need to have positive relationships with people and limited violence, no violence, is a much higher need than scenario 1.
I think
you got 2 people over here.
I missed him. Sorry. Please.
I would say both, obviously. You could just have both of them
Yeah,
done.
they're both good things.
But I think the point is really, I don't know anything about bioengineering anything, and so I wouldn't be able to do that. But also, if we're going to fix the environmental problem or postpone it or whatever, we still have to live with each other, right? And you have this question of, is it better to just kind of hold off make these stopgaps or whatever to postpone issues, or just figure out today what we're going to do to relate to one another and survive in more social scenarios.
Is there another hand?
So I think importantly we're talking about the feasibility, not the importance, right? I guess I would say cynically, it seems like 1 is more likely to happen because I don't think that the dominant social paradigm for change in our society right now embraces the methodology that we've talked about here. I think it embraces like a profit-centered methodology, and I think that there's profits to be had in scenario 1, and I think that there's profits to be had in scenario 2, but not ones that the system is set up to process. They're like externalities.
Mm-hmm. Please.
I have a different orientation.
One more thing, and then you.
One of the things that I have had to ponder in the course of preparing for this experience is the question, why Shriver? Now, we had the quip, well, it's easy to fire a brother-in-law, but that's really just a quip. And one of the ideas that have come to my mind actually derives from Leo Strauss's course in the Republic, which I attended in 1950. And he has a wonderful simile, He asked the question, so why do they descend from Athens to the Piraeus? Why is the dialogue set in the commercial seaport? Joseph P. Kennedy, the patriarch, was an extraordinarily worldly man. He did not live in Athens. He lived in Piraeus. If you think about the people who were the closest aides to JFK, Ted Sorensen, Kenny O'Donnell, Ralph Dungan, they were men of actually virtually no worldly experience. Their sole experience was in a very rarefied and limited sphere of politics. I've often asked the question to myself, so why did JFK choose Sarge? Now, he chose Sarge not only for the Peace Corps, you must understand. First of all, if you're familiar with the famous Mrs. Martin Luther King phone call, the calculations that Sarge made in order to persuade the president to make that phone call are the calculations of a worldly man. That is to say, he knew the president was going to make this speech in Chicago. He knew he would be surrounded by the usual hangers-on who were not particularly friendly to the brother-in-law. He understood the importance of the president demonstrating compassion at this moment when Martin Luther King was in jail, actually being transported to some faraway jail, not exactly clear whether he's going to be lynched or not lynched. And so Sarge describes in a remarkable oral history that's on file in Columbia, step by step, how he plotted getting the phone number, making sure that Mrs. King would be there, structuring his opportunity with JFK so that all of the naysayers would be in a different room. You're smiling, but that's critical. And persuading him to make the call, which he did. And we know that at least some people think that that call was decisive in terms of changing politics of black Americans from the party of Lincoln to the Democratic Party. That's not the only time that JFK turned to Sarge to do something unusual. At the convention, he asked Sarge to go to see Johnson quietly and find out if Johnson would accept the vice presidency. And the morning after election, everyone convened at Hyannis. At the end of that session, handing out assignments, he turned to Sarge and he said, "And I want you to staff the government." All of these things, the Martin Luther King phone call, the sounding out of Johnson, the staffing of the government, all of these things infuriated Robert Kennedy and the other people whose whole experience in life was politics. But I'm quite convinced, thinking about it, that JFK understood that only a worldly man, only a businessman, only someone who had spent a career in Chicago finding out what made the city tick and how he could make it tick, who had taken principled stands with respect to school integration, with respect to the Catholic Church in Chicago. Sarge hated established Catholicism. He used to spat out, when he and I would talk about religion, his vehement enmity toward what he called the clerics. If he had been alive today to see what happened to Pope Francis's proposal to the bishops and how the bishops reacted to that, Sarge would have said, "Just confirms my view. What's wrong with the Catholic Church over all these centuries? It's the clerics." So we're talking about a guy who had a method, that is certainly true, but it was a method that was described from experience, real world experience, and faith.
Do you want to make your?
I just want to, I see more potential in scenario two because there's actually mutual communication. Like, I think there could be a really nice synergy effect between the volunteers and the people in the program. As in scenario one, I just see like a one-sided.
Thank you. Yes?
I would wage on two, because no one would wage on one. Because it's so easy to sell one, that you don't need to convince people that that's a good thing.
Right.
But with scenario two, it's not really intuitive to the broader population, right? Because it has the potential to completely change the city.
Mm-hmm. So you'd wager on it? Well, the proposal has been put forward. You may have read about it, and I'm going to stop now, and Dylan will.
I'll come over in just a second.
Okay. It's okay to mention Alderman Solis. I guess you know, over the 4th of July weekend, there were 60 shootings in Chicago, 11 deaths, a couple by police. And Alderman Solis proposed or floated the idea of creating a Chicago Peace Corps for university graduates to go into high violence, economically distressed communities to make peace. He didn't exactly know what it would entail to do that, but he's floated it to the mayor, and I don't think it's gone very far. But for my money, it would be fun in the winter and spring to figure that out. And so that's the kind of thing I'm thinking that for those of you who want to go on and to work, to continue to actually take this method and do some problem solving with it and all that's involved, that'd be the kind of problem we would tackle.
Thank you so much, Jamie and Bill. Can we get a round of applause? And I think what Jamie just mentioned is a great example of, as he said, what we're hoping to do, which is we get to think about some of the methods and processes here, and then we want to see you guys, put it into action and really build something. And so we're excited for that component of the project. So what we're going to do now is, this concludes the formal part of this first workshop. We do have this room for another hour, and what we would love is anybody who would like to stay and talk with Jamie and with a number of us who are going to stay here to kind of answer any other questions about the material, or really ask questions you didn't feel comfortable asking the big group, whatever it is, and just kind of talk about, get into the nitty gritty of some of this content. We'd be more than happy to do that from 2 to 3. And then other people who have to head out, more than happy to have you head out. And then next week, November 7th, is our next workshop right here, 12 o'clock, 12 to 2, and lunch will be served. And you'll get a lot of follow-up information from us. We'll get you the PowerPoint. It may not have all of the videos, but we'll get you the PowerPoint. We'll get you the documents. Bill mentioned we had sent those out, but a few people came in who hadn't previously registered, so we'll make sure that you have follow-up and then that about next week. And we'd love to see you back here. So thanks so much.